Marine Corporal Sarah Martinez adjusted her rifle as the convoy rolled through the dusty streets of Fallujah. The Iraqi sun beat down mercilessly on the armored vehicles, and sweat dripped down her face despite the early morning hour. She had been deployed for 8 months, and every day brought new challenges in this war-torn city. The radio crackled with routine check-ins as their 4-vehicle patrol made its way toward the suspected weapons cache location. Sarah was the only woman in her unit, a fact that had initially drawn skepticism from some of her fellow Marines. Over time, her sharp shooting skills and unwavering determination had earned their respect. At 23 years old, she had already survived 3 previous deployments and had become known for her ability to stay calm under pressure. Her hometown of Phoenix seemed like a distant memory as she scanned the rooftops for any sign of movement. The intelligence report had indicated possible insurgent activity in the northern sector of the city. Local informants had reported strange movements around an abandoned school building, suggesting it might be used as a weapons storage facility. Sarah's unit was tasked with conducting a reconnaissance mission to gather information and assess the threat level. The mission was supposed to be routine, but in Fallujah, nothing was ever truly routine. As their convoy turned onto a narrow street lined with damaged buildings, Sarah noticed the unusual quiet. Normally, there would be some civilian activity, children playing, or vendors trying to sell goods to the soldiers. Today, the streets were eerily empty. She keyed her radio to report the observation to her squad leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, who was riding in the lead vehicle. The silence was often a warning sign that something was about to happen. The first explosion came without warning. A roadside bomb detonated near the 3rd vehicle in the convoy, sending a massive cloud of dust and debris into the air. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the entire Humvee several feet off the ground before it crashed back down, its armor plating cracked and smoking. Sarah felt her vehicle lurch as her driver swerved to avoid the wreckage, and she immediately began scanning for the source of the attack. Within seconds, gunfire erupted from multiple buildings surrounding the convoy. Muzzle flashes appeared from windows, rooftops, and doorways as insurgents opened fire with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Sarah's training kicked in instantly, and she began returning fire while trying to identify the enemy positions. The sound of bullets striking their armored vehicle created a metallic symphony of danger that filled the air. Her squad leader's voice came through the radio, ordering the convoy to establish a defensive perimeter. But the narrow street made maneuvering difficult, and the damaged vehicle was blocking part of their escape route. Sarah could see that they were trapped in what military tacticians called a kill zone. Surrounded by hostile forces with limited options for retreat, the insurgents had clearly planned this ambush carefully, choosing a location that maximized their advantage. As Sarah continued to engage targets, she noticed movement on a rooftop approximately 200 meters to her left. An insurgent was setting up what appeared to be a heavy machine gun, a weapon that could devastate their convoy if allowed to become operational. She adjusted her aim and fired 3 quick shots, watching as the figure fell backward. Her marksmanship training had paid off once again, but there were still multiple threats surrounding their position. The intensity of the firefight continued to escalate as more insurgents joined the battle. Sarah could hear the distinct whistle of incoming mortars, and explosions began rocking the area around their convoy. Shrapnel from a nearby blast struck the side of her vehicle, and she felt a sharp pain in her left shoulder. When she reached up to check, her hand came away bloody, but the wound was not severe enough to stop her from fighting. During a brief lull in the gunfire, Sarah heard her squad leader calling for air support and medical evacuation. The radio communications were becoming increasingly frantic as reports came in of multiple casualties in the convoy. The vehicle that had been hit by the roadside bomb was severely damaged, and several Marines were trapped inside. Sarah could see smoke rising from the wreckage and knew that time was running short for any rescue attempt. A rocket-propelled grenade struck the building directly above Sarah's position, sending chunks of concrete and metal raining down on their vehicle. The impact was so close that it temporarily deafened her, leaving her ears ringing as she tried to maintain her defensive position. She could taste dust and cordite in the air, and her eyes watered from the smoke that was beginning to fill the street. As the battle raged on, Sarah realized that their ammunition was beginning to run low. She had already gone through 4 magazines, and the resupply truck was trapped behind the damaged vehicle. Her driver, Private Johnson, was doing his best to keep their Humvee positioned for optimal defense, but the engine was starting to smoke from damage sustained in the attack. They needed to either break out of the ambush or hold their position until reinforcements arrived. The insurgents seemed to have an endless supply of ammunition and fighters. Every time Sarah thought she had neutralized a position, more gunfire would emerge from a different location. It was becoming clear that this was not a small group of opportunistic attackers, but rather a well-organized and heavily armed force that had been waiting for exactly this type of opportunity. The Marines were outnumbered and outgunned in hostile territory. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to assess their tactical situation. The narrow street provided limited escape routes, and the damaged convoy vehicle was effectively blocking their retreat. Moving forward would mean advancing into what was clearly a prepared killing field, while staying in place meant becoming sitting targets for the insurgent mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. Every option seemed to carry enormous risk. As she reloaded her rifle for what felt like the 100th time, Sarah noticed that the gunfire from the damaged vehicle had stopped completely. Either the Marines inside were conserving ammunition, or they were no longer able to fight. The thought of her fellow Marines being wounded or killed filled her with a cold determination to keep fighting, no matter what the odds. She had sworn an oath to leave no one behind, and she intended to keep that promise. The sun was reaching its peak intensity, and the temperature inside their armored vehicle was becoming unbearable. Combined with the stress of combat and the adrenaline coursing through her system, Sarah was beginning to feel the effects of dehydration and exhaustion, but she knew that showing any sign of weakness could be fatal in this situation. She forced herself to focus on the immediate threats and continue engaging targets as they appeared. A new sound reached her ears through the chaos of battle: the distinctive rotor noise of approaching helicopters. For a moment, hope surged through her chest as she thought reinforcements might be arriving. But as the aircraft came into view, she realized they were still too far away to provide immediate support. The insurgents seemed to recognize this as well, because their rate of fire increased dramatically as they tried to inflict maximum damage before help arrived. Sarah's shoulder wound was beginning to throb with increasing intensity, and she could feel blood seeping through her uniform. The injury was affecting her aim slightly, but not enough to prevent her from continuing to engage targets. She knew that field medics always said that if you could still fight, the wound was not life-threatening. She clung to that thought as she continued to return fire at the insurgent positions surrounding their convoy. The long night. The helicopter gunships finally arrived just as the insurgents launched their most coordinated attack yet. Sarah watched through her rifle scope as the aircraft swept in low, their chain guns blazing as they engaged the rooftop positions. The heavy caliber rounds chewed through concrete and steel, sending insurgents diving for cover. For the first time in hours, Sarah felt like they might have a chance to survive this nightmare. But victory was short-lived. As one of the helicopters made a low pass over the street, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked up from a concealed position and struck its tail rotor. Sarah watched in horror as the aircraft spun out of control, trailing smoke and debris as it crashed into a building 3 blocks away. The explosion sent a massive fireball into the sky, and she knew that any hope of immediate rescue had just gone up in flames. The loss of air support seemed to embolden the insurgents, who resumed their attack with renewed intensity. Sarah could see muzzle flashes coming from at least a dozen different positions, and the volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. She pressed herself against the armored side of her vehicle as bullets sparked off the metal around her. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she knew that without reinforcements, they would not be able to hold their position much longer. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, barely audible over the sound of gunfire. He was calling for all units to prepare for a fighting withdrawal to a more defensible position. Sarah could see a partially collapsed building about 50 meters to their right that might provide better cover, but reaching it would require crossing open ground under heavy enemy fire. The decision would essentially be a choice between certain death in their current position or probable death attempting to move. As Sarah prepared to acknowledge the order, a sniper's bullet shattered the radio in her vehicle. The electronic equipment sparked and went dead, cutting off their communication with the rest of the convoy. She and Private Johnson were now isolated, unable to coordinate with their fellow Marines or receive updated orders. The psychological impact of losing communication was almost as devastating as the tactical disadvantage it created. Private Johnson turned to look at Sarah, his young face pale with fear and exhaustion. At 19 years old, this was his first combat deployment, and she could see that he was struggling to maintain his composure. Sarah knew that as the senior Marine in their vehicle, it was her responsibility to keep him focused and fighting. She grabbed his shoulder and shouted over the gunfire that they needed to keep shooting and stay alert for any opportunity to move. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Sarah realized with growing dread that they would soon be fighting in darkness, which would give the insurgents an enormous advantage. The enemy fighters knew the terrain intimately, while the Marines were unfamiliar with the layout of the surrounding buildings. Night would bring new dangers and make rescue operations exponentially more difficult. As if responding to her thoughts, the insurgents began using different tactics as the light faded. Instead of maintaining sustained fire, they started launching coordinated attacks from multiple directions, forcing the Marines to constantly adjust their defensive positions. Sarah found herself spinning from one threat to another, trying to cover all possible approaches to their vehicle. The stress was beginning to take a serious toll on her physical and mental stamina. A mortar round exploded just 20 meters from their position, showering their vehicle with concrete fragments and twisted metal. The blast was close enough to make Sarah's ears ring again, and she felt warm blood trickling down from a small cut on her cheek. Private Johnson was thrown against the side of the vehicle by the concussion, and for a moment she thought he had been seriously injured. But he quickly recovered and resumed his position behind the machine gun. As full darkness settled over Fallujah, the nature of the battle changed dramatically. The insurgents began using hit-and-run tactics, appearing suddenly to fire a few shots before disappearing back into the shadows. Sarah found herself shooting at muzzle flashes and hoping for the best, unable to clearly identify targets in the darkness. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical attacks, keeping the Marines in a constant state of tension and fear. Around midnight, Sarah noticed that the firing from the other vehicles in the convoy had decreased significantly. She feared that her fellow Marines were either running out of ammunition or had sustained casualties that prevented them from maintaining their defensive fire. The isolation was becoming more complete with each passing hour, and she began to wonder if anyone would survive until morning. The insurgents seemed to sense the weakening resistance and began probing closer to the convoy positions. Sarah could hear voices speaking in Arabic, apparently coordinating for what might be a final assault. She checked her ammunition supply and discovered that she was down to her last 2 magazines. Private Johnson's machine gun was also running low on ammunition, and they had no way to resupply without leaving the protection of their vehicle. A new threat emerged from an unexpected direction when Sarah heard the sound of vehicles approaching from the east. At first, she hoped it might be Marine reinforcements, but the engine noise was wrong for American military vehicles. As the sounds grew closer, she realized that the insurgents were bringing in additional fighters and possibly heavy weapons. The tactical situation was becoming impossible. Sarah made the difficult decision to conserve ammunition by engaging only the most immediate threats. Every shot had to count, because once their ammunition was exhausted, they would be defenseless. She instructed Private Johnson to do the same with the machine gun, firing only when targets presented clear and present dangers to their position. The psychological pressure of rationing ammunition while under attack was almost unbearable. As the night wore on, Sarah began to experience the effects of prolonged combat stress. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she found it difficult to maintain steady aim. Dehydration and exhaustion were taking their toll, but she knew that any sign of weakness could be fatal. She forced herself to focus on the basics of marksmanship and tried to ignore the growing fear that they would not survive until dawn. The insurgents launched another coordinated attack just before 3 in the morning. This time, they seemed determined to overrun the convoy positions through sheer force of numbers. Sarah could see shapes moving in the darkness, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. She opened fire with controlled bursts, trying to make every round count, while Private Johnson engaged targets with the machine gun. During the intense firefight, Sarah felt a sharp burning sensation in her left leg. When she reached down to check, her hand came away wet with blood. A bullet had grazed her thigh, creating a painful but not immediately life-threatening wound. The injury added to her growing collection of battle damage, but she forced herself to continue fighting despite the pain. The attack continued for nearly an hour before the insurgents finally withdrew back into the shadows. Sarah counted at least 8 enemy fighters that she and Private Johnson had killed or wounded during the assault, but she knew there were many more still out there. The temporary victory felt hollow, because she understood that the enemy was simply regrouping for another attempt. As dawn approached, Sarah allowed herself to hope that rescue might be possible once daylight returned. Military doctrine called for rescue operations to be conducted during daylight hours when possible, and she knew that search and rescue teams would be looking for them, but she also understood that the insurgents would be equally determined to prevent any rescue attempt, and the coming day would likely bring even more intense fighting. Private Johnson had been wounded during the night attack, taking shrapnel in his right arm from a grenade explosion. Sarah helped him bandage the wound using supplies from their first aid kit, but the injury was affecting his ability to operate the machine gun effectively. She realized that she might soon be fighting alone, and the prospect filled her with cold determination rather than fear. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the first faint traces of dawn when Sarah heard the distant sound of helicopters again. This time, the rotor noise seemed to be coming from multiple aircraft, suggesting that a major rescue operation might be underway. But she also knew that the insurgents would do everything possible to prevent the rescue, and the next few hours would determine whether any of the Marines would make it home alive. Dawn brought no relief from the relentless enemy fire. Sarah had been awake for over 36 hours, and her body was running purely on adrenaline and determination. Private Johnson had lost consciousness from blood loss during the early morning hours, leaving Sarah completely alone to defend their position. She had moved him to the most protected area of their vehicle and done what she could to treat his wounds, but she knew he needed immediate medical attention. The helicopter sounds she had heard earlier had faded away, and Sarah began to fear that the rescue mission had been called off due to the intense enemy resistance. Radio intercepts suggested that the insurgents had brought in anti-aircraft weapons specifically to prevent helicopter operations in the area. Every few minutes, she could hear rockets being fired at aircraft that she could not see, followed by the sound of explosions in the distance. Sarah's ammunition situation had become critical. She was down to her final magazine, with only 28 rounds remaining. Each shot had to be perfectly placed, because once her ammunition was exhausted, she would have only her sidearm and whatever weapons she could recover from fallen insurgents. The mathematical reality of her situation was stark. She could not possibly hold out much longer against the dozens of enemy fighters surrounding their position. Around 9 in the morning, Sarah noticed increased movement in the buildings around the convoy. The insurgents seemed to be positioning for what would probably be their final assault. She could see fighters moving from position to position, clearly coordinating their attack plan. Some were carrying heavy weapons, including what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades and light machine guns. The overwhelming firepower they were bringing to bear left little doubt about their intentions. As Sarah prepared for what might be her last stand, she thought about her family back home in Phoenix. Her younger brother had just started college, and her parents had been so proud when she earned her promotion to corporal. She wondered if they would ever know exactly what happened in this dusty street in Fallujah, or if she would simply become another casualty statistic in a war that seemed to have no clear end in sight. The insurgent attack began with a massive barrage of rocket-propelled grenades and mortar rounds. The explosions were so close that Sarah could feel the shock waves in her chest, and debris rained down constantly on their vehicle. She pressed herself against the armored plating and tried to return fire when opportunities presented themselves, but the volume of incoming rounds made it almost impossible to expose herself long enough to aim properly. During a brief lull in the bombardment, Sarah heard a new sound that made her heart race with hope: the distinctive rotor noise of Navy SEALs helicopters. These aircraft were specially modified for combat operations and were much more heavily armed than standard transport helicopters. She allowed herself to believe for the first time in hours that rescue might actually be possible. The SEAL helicopters came in low and fast, using the damaged buildings for cover as they approached the convoy location. Sarah could see door gunners laying down suppressive fire as the aircraft maneuvered to avoid the anti-aircraft weapons that the insurgents had positioned around the area. The sound of heavy machine gun fire from the helicopters was like music to Sarah's ears, representing the first effective support they had received since the ambush began. As the helicopters established a defensive perimeter around the convoy, Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of fast roping operations beginning. Navy SEALs were rappelling directly into the combat zone, bringing with them the training and equipment necessary to fight their way through the insurgent positions. She knew that SEAL teams were specifically trained for exactly this type of high-risk rescue operation. The insertion was not without casualties. Sarah watched as one SEAL was hit by sniper fire while descending his rope, but his teammates immediately moved to provide medical assistance and continue the mission. The professionalism and courage of the rescue team was evident in every movement, as they methodically cleared enemy positions while advancing toward the trapped Marines. A SEAL team leader reached Sarah's position after what felt like an eternity of intense fighting. His face was covered with camouflage paint, and his equipment was state-of-the-art compared to standard Marine gear. He quickly assessed Sarah's condition, and that of Private Johnson, before calling for immediate medical evacuation. Sarah tried to brief him on the tactical situation, but found that her voice was barely a whisper after hours of shouting over gunfire. The SEAL medic, who arrived moments later, was shocked by the extent of Sarah's injuries. In addition to the wounds she was aware of, she had sustained multiple additional injuries from shrapnel and bullet fragments. The medic counted 13 separate wounds on her body, ranging from minor cuts to serious trauma that required immediate surgical intervention. The fact that she was still conscious and fighting was nothing short of miraculous. As the SEALs prepared to evacuate the casualties, the insurgents launched one final desperate attack. Apparently realizing that their opportunity to inflict maximum damage was slipping away, they committed all their remaining fighters to a suicidal assault on the rescue operation. The intensity of the fighting reached levels that even the experienced SEALs had rarely encountered in their careers. Sarah insisted on providing covering fire during the evacuation, despite her injuries and exhaustion. Using a rifle borrowed from one of the SEALs, she engaged insurgent targets while the medics loaded Private Johnson onto a stretcher. Her marksmanship skills, even in her weakened condition, impressed the SEAL team leader, who later said he had never seen more accurate shooting under such extreme circumstances. The helicopter extraction was conducted under intense enemy fire, with door gunners and ground-based SEALs providing continuous suppressive fire to protect the aircraft. Sarah was loaded onto the helicopter along with several other wounded Marines who had been recovered from the other vehicles in the convoy. As the aircraft lifted off, she could see the full extent of the battlefield for the first time, with damaged buildings and smoking vehicles scattered throughout the area. During the flight to the field hospital, Sarah learned that the ambush had been even more extensive than she had realized. The insurgents had used a sophisticated network of tunnels and prepared positions to coordinate their attack, and intelligence estimates suggested that over 100 fighters had participated in the operation. The fact that any Marines had survived such an overwhelming assault was considered remarkable by military analysts. At the field hospital, doctors were amazed by Sarah's condition. Despite having sustained 13 separate wounds and fighting continuously for over 48 hours without food or adequate water, her vital signs were stable, and she remained conscious and alert. The combination of excellent physical conditioning, superior training, and sheer determination had enabled her to survive what should have been a fatal encounter. The rescue operation had cost the lives of 3 SEALs and resulted in injuries to 7 others, but it had successfully recovered 12 Marines from the ambush site. Private Johnson survived his injuries and made a full recovery, later crediting Sarah's first aid and protection during the night for saving his life. The bond formed between the survivors of that terrible day would last for the rest of their lives. Military investigators later determined that the ambush had been planned for weeks, with insurgents carefully studying American patrol patterns and preparing the kill zone with elaborate attention to detail. The fact that the Marines had survived as long as they did was attributed to their training, determination, and the exceptional courage displayed by individuals like Sarah Martinez. The intelligence gathered from the operation led to significant improvements in convoy security procedures. Sarah spent 6 weeks recovering in military hospitals before being medically evacuated to the United States. Her injuries were serious enough to end her military career, but she had already earned a place in Marine Corps history. The story of her 48-hour stand in Fallujah became legendary among military personnel, inspiring countless others who faced similar situations in combat zones around the world. Years later, Sarah would often be asked about that day in Fallujah and how she found the strength to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. Her answer was always the same. She had made a commitment to her fellow Marines and her country. And that commitment meant never giving up. No matter how impossible the situation might seem, the 13 wounds she carried were not just scars from battle, but permanent reminders of the price of freedom and the bonds forged between warriors who faced death together. The SEAL team leader who had rescued her later said that Sarah Martinez represented everything that was best about the American military: courage under fire, dedication to duty, and an unbreakable spirit that refused to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. Her story became a testament to the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when they are tested by the most extreme circumstances imaginable.